April 12, 1945, north of Okinawa. The radar scope glowed a faint green in the darkened Combat Information Center. The sea beyond was calm, deceptively calm, beneath a gray pre-dawn haze. On the destroyer USS Cassin Young, men whispered over headsets, the air thick with cigarette smoke and nerves. The clock ticked past 500 hours. Multiple bogies, bearing 210, range 70 miles, came the voice of the radar operator. The dots were faint at first, then multiplied, dozens of them, creeping closer in perfect formation. The fighter direction officer leaned toward his microphone, his voice steady and low. Vector Angels 10, intercept course 210. Make your run. Above, unseen in the first light, a pair of F-4U Corsairs rolled into position, guided only by that green glow below. Minutes later, the scope began to clear. One by one, the blips vanished before they ever reached the fleet. No one on deck saw the kills. Only silence and the smell of salt and ozone. Radar had turned the invisible sky into a battlefield. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a struggle of endurance and precision. Japan's empire was cornered, its supply lines strangled, yet its military resolve burned fiercely. The island of Okinawa, just 350 miles from Kyushu, was the final step before an invasion of Japan itself, a natural fortress of ridges, caves, and coral, defended by 120,000 men under General Mitsuru Ushijima. To the Americans, it was the key to victory. To the Japanese, the last stand. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet moved toward Okinawa with an armada unlike any ever assembled, 1,600 ships stretching across the Pacific horizon. Among them, the fast carrier task force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, carriers Essex, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and others, would dominate the skies. But beyond the carriers and battleships, another revolution was at work, an invisible web of radar pulses spinning in rhythm across the ocean. For years, radar had evolved from crude experiments in the 1930s into one of America's most decisive advantages. The Navy's SK and SP air search sets, operating from the towering masts of destroyers and carriers, could detect aircraft more than 100 miles away, long before any human eye could glimpse them. Yet radar alone wasn't enough. Its true power came from coordination, a symphony of machines, men, and mathematics that turned lightless dots into tactical clarity. The U.S. had learned the lessons of Pearl Harbor and the early disasters of 1942. From the Solomons to the Philippines, fighter direction had matured into a science. Now, on the eve of Okinawa, the Americans had perfected it. Combat Information Centers, CICs, sat deep within the steel hearts of destroyers and carriers, dim rooms packed with scopes, plotting boards, and trained voices speaking a language of precision. Bogey, bandit, vector, angels, base. These words meant life and death. When the landings began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, radar networks stretched like a net across the sea. 17 radar picket stations were established in a ring up to 70 miles north and west of the main fleet. Destroyers such as Laffey, Manert L. Abel, and Bush were placed far out in isolation, their radars spinning constantly, their crews watching for the first sign of incoming raids. They were the early warning eyes of the fleet, and often its sacrificial shields. Each picket destroyer carried its own CAP, Combat Air Patrol, usually 4 to 6 fighters, constantly rotated from nearby carriers or Okinawa's newly captured airfields at Yontan and Kadena. At the core of this defense lay the U.S. Navy's fighter direction officers, trained to interpret radar echoes and vector pilots with flawless timing. Many were barely in their 20s, yet they commanded the movements of entire air groups through radio contact alone. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki commanded the 5th Air Fleet, determined to hurl every remaining aircraft against the Americans. Conventional warfare had failed. Now desperation ruled. Ugaki's strategy was brutal. Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, massed waves of kamikaze and escort fighters launched from Kyushu. Between April and June, 10 such operations would send nearly 1,800 aircraft into the storm of American radar and firepower. The Japanese believed in surprise, in low-level approaches under cloud cover, and in timing their strikes to overwhelm defenses. They could not yet grasp that the Americans had built something far deadlier than eyesight, an electronic shield that could see through night, cloud, and deception. As the first Kikusui attacks began on April 6th 7th, radar pickets spotted them early. Fighter direction centers plotted every movement, feeding real-time intercepts to Corsair and Hellcat squadrons. Japanese pilots, expecting open skies, instead flew into waiting guns and invisible ambushes guided by coordinates alone. Each day at Okinawa became a test, not of courage, which both sides had in abundance, but of systems, radar, discipline, and endurance. What began as scattered dots on a green scope would soon decide the fate of thousands above and below the sea. The Japanese High Command entered the Battle of Okinawa with a conviction born of old experience, that surprise and spirit could outweigh machinery. Their kamikaze pilots had struck devastating blows at Leyte Gulf months earlier, slipping through chaotic skies and crippling American carriers. They believed radar, like any weapon, had limits. Weather, terrain, altitude, these were nature's allies. If they flew low enough beneath cloud banks, hugging the sea, radar would fail to see them. They were wrong. The Americans had studied every approach. From Kyushu, from Amami-Oshima, from Formosa, radar outposts plotted every possible route. The Navy's picket destroyers sat like sentinels, 60 and 70 miles ahead of the fleet, their rotating antennas sweeping the sky without pause. When a Japanese formation lifted from the mainland, signals intelligence and long-range radar stations picked them up almost immediately. Communication circuits linked each picket to the fighter director officer aboard the flagship and to the combat air patrol overhead. Inside those CICs, there was no chaos, no emotion, only the hum of machines and the rhythmic voices of men trained to think in numbers. Every bogey was logged, tracked, identified, and assigned. On the plotting boards, grease pencil lines stretched outward like threads from a spider's web. Intercept 210, Angels 10. Pilots received their orders with calm precision, turning on command, diving into clouds toward coordinates they couldn't see, trusting that somewhere out there a green dot meant death. The Japanese, by contrast, fought half-blind. Many aircraft lacked functioning radios, relying instead on hand signals and colored flares. Radar navigation was still in infancy. Most pilots depended on celestial orientation or coastal landmarks, difficult, even impossible, under overcast skies or smoke. They believed the ocean's immensity gave them protection, but American radars could read their movements long before any scout plane could confirm. As kamikaze formations began their low-level runs, they encountered interceptors appearing from nowhere. F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs dropped from altitude with the sun behind them, guided by radar vectors that placed them precisely where the enemy would be, not where he was. It was warfare by prediction, mathematics replacing instinct. By April 10th, after the first Kikusui assaults, Japanese intelligence began to suspect a network controlling American fighters. But their understanding was shallow. They assumed it was localized, one or two ships using radar to cue nearby patrols. In truth, the system was vast. Destroyers, carriers, amphibious flagships, and even new GCI units ashore at Yantan and Kadena all linked into one overlapping grid. Every wave of attackers faced that invisible net. The results were catastrophic. Out of every 100 planes launched, fewer than 20 reached their targets. The rest were either turned back, lost, or shot down far out to sea. The Americans paid dearly. Radar pickets like Bush, Colquhoun, and Luce were sunk by sheer weight of numbers, but the majority of the fleet remained intact. In the Japanese after-action reports, pilots described confusion. "The Americans knew we were coming," one survivor later recalled. "Before we saw the ships, their fighters were already upon us." Some accused traitors or spies. Others believed divine favor had left them. Few realized that technology, not mysticism, had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. By the end of April, the pattern was unmistakable. Every new Kikusui wave met resistance farther and farther from Okinawa as radar range and coordination improved. The Americans were learning faster than their enemies could adapt. What Japan believed would be a battle of honor was becoming a study in precision. The stage was set for the climactic weeks ahead, when technology, endurance, and sacrifice would decide the fate of the skies. The invisible shield radar was no longer experimental by 1945. It was operational mastery. The U.S. Navy's SK and SP air search radars rotated ceaselessly, sweeping the sky hundreds of times per minute, their pulses echoing back from clouds, land, and aircraft. In the darkened rooms of combat information centers, operators read those reflections as if they were the weather: calm, storm, or death approaching. The precision was astonishing for its time. A skilled operator could judge altitude, heading, and speed from nothing but signal rhythm. Each destroyer picket carried not one, but several radar systems: air search for long range, surface search for low-flying planes, and height-finding sets tied into analog computers. With these, the Navy created three-dimensional awareness. Angels denoted altitude in thousands of feet. Bogies tracked unknowns. Once a bogey was confirmed hostile, the entire web adjusted, carriers repositioned, caps stacked by altitude, and anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. What made radar revolutionary was not merely detection, it was coordination. Fighter direction officers received real-time data from multiple ships, plotting incoming threats in layered grids. Through voice radio, they directed interceptors using calm, clipped commands. Turn left 270, increase speed, contact expected in 1 minute. The pilots often never saw the ocean below until tracer fire confirmed the kill. This union of electronics, calculation, and discipline was what the Japanese never anticipated, a weapon of timing and trust, not of visibility. Turning dots into victory radar alone did not win battles. Men did. American tactics turned information into survival. The key lay in vectoring, predicting where enemy aircraft would intersect with the patrol arcs of American fighters. The Navy perfected this in the Marianas, but at Okinawa it reached its most refined form. Fighter direction officers managed layers of CAP, combat air patrol, at different angles, typically 10, 15, and 20,000 feet, positioned between the radar pickets and the fleet. When a contact appeared on radar, the nearest cap would be vectored to intercept, while outer layers adjusted position to block stragglers. Each pilot carried a radio tuned to a specific controller, creating an invisible geometry of movement across hundreds of miles. When the system worked perfectly, and it often did, a kamikaze raid disintegrated long before it could dive. Some attacks broke apart under pressure, others turned back, fuel running low from evasive maneuvers. Pilots later compared radar vectoring to fighting with a god's eye: omniscient, calm, mathematical. The power behind the sky. Behind radar and tactics stood a force Japan could no longer match: logistics. The United States industrial output had become its second weapon. While Japan scraped together aging trainers and volunteer pilots, America fielded a sky full of replacements. Damaged ships were repaired within days. New radar sets were installed within weeks. Spare parts, fuses, and ammunition flowed constantly from the vast supply base at Ulithi to the front. Fuel convoys sustained both the picket line and the island airfields. Every lost Corsair or Hellcat was replaced almost instantly, ensuring no gap in cap coverage. Even radar operators, once a scarce skill, were rotated and retrained under systematic schedules. This depth of resources allowed continuous vigilance, 24 hours a day, through storms and exhaustion. To the Japanese, this seemed impossible. Reconnaissance pilots reported that even after massive raids, the same number of enemy aircraft appeared the next day. What they did not realize was that radar coordination minimized loss by efficiency. Fewer planes wasted on futile patrols, fewer ships surprised by sudden attack. Okinawa became the proving ground not just for courage, but for organization. Every radar pulse, every plotted intercept, every replacement fuselage delivered by convoy represented a single unified principle: industrial science serving the human will to endure. These three angles, technology, tactics, and logistics, together formed a machine that Japan could neither match nor outthink. Yet the story was not merely one of machinery, it was of men, on both sides, facing the limits of their endurance within that mechanical rhythm of detection and destruction. Minds that directed the machine. At the heart of the radar war were men whose command lay not on open decks, but in darkened rooms filled with humming equipment. Admirals Spruance and Mitcher embodied calm control. Spruance, the cerebral strategist, planned the radar picket network like a chessboard. Mitcher, the aggressive carrier commander, demanded constant air superiority and believed in letting technology multiply his pilots' reach. But below them, hundreds of lesser-known officers made the system function. Fighter direction officers, FDOs, many just out of college, bore immense responsibility. A single mistake in timing could doom a destroyer or carrier. Lieutenant J.G. R.E. Dixon aboard USS Morrison once guided 6 KP flights simultaneously, tracking over 50 separate radar contacts while his ship came under attack. When asked later how he managed, he said simply, "We trusted the scope." Leadership during Okinawa wasn't just about command. It was about restraint. Spruance's decision to hold his carriers farther offshore, relying on radar for extended-range defense, was controversial. Critics feared it spread the fleet too thin. But the outcome proved him right. Radar extended their reach beyond visual combat, reducing surprise to near zero. Under his quiet, methodical leadership, technology became the fleet's strongest armor. The vanishing sky. For the Japanese pilots, the Battle of Okinawa was an experience of vanishing certainty. They took off from Kyushu airfields in formations of 50 or 100, carrying the red insignia of the rising sun, and prayers tied beneath their cockpits. Yet halfway across the East China Sea, the world would begin to unravel. First came static on the radio. American jamming, they thought. Then came confusion as formation leaders struggled to maintain bearings through haze and broken cloud. And then, suddenly, interceptors, American fighters diving from impossible angles, emerging from clouds without warning. Survivors described it as being hunted by ghosts. The Americans rarely fought on equal terms. Guided by radar, they attacked from altitude, from the sun, or head-on. Many kamikaze never even saw the ships they sought. In Japanese debriefings, officers tried to understand, how could the enemy always know the exact bearing and altitude of their approach? The answer, radar integration, remained a mystery to most of them until after the war. Worse still was morale. The younger pilots, barely trained, faced the inevitability of dying without striking a blow. Their senior officers invoked honor and sacrifice, but the skies betrayed them. Our eyes could no longer find the enemy one pilot wrote. It was as if heaven itself sided with the Americans. The price of constant vigilance. For the Americans, radar victory came at a brutal human cost. Life aboard the radar pickets was relentless. Crews rotated through watch stations every few hours, eyes fixed on green screens until vision blurred. The stress was constant. One false reading, one delayed vector, could mean annihilation. The picket ships bore the brunt of every attack. Out on the perimeter, 70 miles from the main fleet, they were isolated and exposed. When raids broke through, destroyers like USS Bush, Luce, and Callahan faced dozens of aircraft alone. Even with radar warning, there were moments when the sky itself seemed to fall. Men learned to recognize the tone of incoming pilots' voices over radio. Calm direction, rising urgency, then static, sometimes followed by the concussive thump of near misses. The CICs filled with heat, smoke, and shouted coordinates as gunners tracked targets invisible to the naked eye. For many, radar became both lifeline and torment, the cold glow marking every moment between safety and destruction. Medical officers later noted exhaustion, hallucinations, and scope blindness, a kind of hypnotic trance from hours of staring into flickering light. But despite the fatigue, discipline held. Crews trusted the system because it worked. They had seen what happened without it at Pearl Harbor, at Leyte, at early Guadalcanal. Now they fought inside a rhythm of pulse and echo, and though it consumed them, it kept them alive. By the end of April, both sides had reached their limits, the Japanese losing planes faster than they could replace them, the Americans fighting sleep as fiercely as the enemy. All awaited the next great assault, the moment radar would face its ultimate test on the deadliest day of the battle. Dawn over the East China Sea came in gray bands of cloud, the sun little more than a pale wound above the horizon. On the American picket line, radar antennas turned like clockwork hands, tracing the empty sky. Then, just after 0600, the emptiness filled, countless echoes blooming across the scopes. Kikusui II had begun. The Japanese launched more than 185 aircraft that morning. 0 fighters, Val dive bombers, Betty bombers, and kamikaze specials armed with 250-kilogram bombs. From Kyushu they flew in staggered groups, hoping to confuse detection. But the Americans were already waiting. Radar stations on USS Bowers, Haggard, and Laffey caught the first reflections 120 miles out. Bearings and speeds were relayed through encoded channels to the flagship USS Bunker Hill, where fighter direction officers converted dots into geometry. In the darkened CIC, Lieutenant Commander John Burke stood before a glowing plotting board. "Group Able, Angels 15, bearing 180, his voice echoed. "Intercept vector 215. Over radio circuits, Corsairs from VMF 323 acknowledged, throttles rising as they turned west. Moments later, another voice. "Group Baker, Angels 10, bearing 240. Hellcats from Essex dropped their tanks and climbed. Within minutes, 40 American fighters filled the sky, unseen by the enemy, each guided by radar vectors accurate to seconds. The Japanese formations still believed they had time. They flew low, under broken clouds, thinking the sea would shield them. But altitude data from height-finding radar betrayed them. At 80 miles out, the first interceptors made contact. From above the cloud layer, the Americans rolled in. The encounter was sudden, clinical, and lethal. Radar had placed them precisely ahead of the lead formation. Machine guns tore through aluminum and flesh. Within 3 minutes, 15 Japanese aircraft fell flaming into the sea. Those behind scattered. Discipline evaporated. Some jettisoned bombs and turned back. Others dove desperately toward imagined targets. Aboard the pickets, radar operators watched the echoes disappear. "Bogey count dropping fast," one noted flatly. Controllers recalculated vectors, sending fresh cap groups to intercept stragglers. By the time the remnants neared Okinawa, fewer than 40 planes remained. At 0940 hours, a second wave approached from a different bearing, a feint meant to draw fighters away. Yet radar coordination again dissolved the plan. The long-range SK set on USS Benion detected them 110 miles out, giving 20 minutes warning. FDOs adjusted intercept courses without hesitation, vectoring replacement flights from Kadena's newly operational strip. The Japanese never saw the adjustment. They simply flew into a wall of American aircraft emerging from cloud cover like phantoms. Through the morning, the sky became a pattern of destruction, measured not by sight, but by instruments. Controllers spoke calmly over the drone of equipment. Splash 2. Splash confirmed. Resume cap pattern. On carriers, pilots returned, rearmed, and were launched again in disciplined rotation. Each victory owed as much to the men reading oscillating lines in steel rooms as to those firing guns in the sky. For the first time, radar and radio had fused into a single operational organism, one that could sense, decide, and strike faster than any human chain of command. The Japanese, once masters of initiative, found themselves reacting to a battle already decided before they arrived. When the final raid of Kikusuya II ended, 97 Japanese aircraft lay destroyed. 14 more ditched short of Kyushu. American losses: 11 fighters, 2 destroyers damaged, no major fleet units struck. That evening, on the flag bridge of Bunker Hill, Admiral Mitcher wrote a brief note to Spruance. Radar coordination flawless, enemy air resistance weakening rapidly. Below deck, operators slumped over scopes, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from hours of tracing light. They knew more waves would come, but the pattern was set. The enemy's element of surprise, once Japan's proudest weapon, was gone forever. Outside, night reclaimed the sea. On the horizon, the picket destroyers pulsed tiny circles of green, sweeping again into darkness, their beams reaching far beyond human sight. The Americans waited, confident that whatever came next would first appear as a faint flicker on a screen, and that flicker, inevitably, would vanish. The morning of April 16th began quietly for the men aboard USS Laffey, DD-724. The destroyer, codenamed Picket Station Number 1, sat 60 miles north of Okinawa, alone, exposed, and vital. Her radar antenna turned ceaselessly against a pale dawn, every sweep a heartbeat in the ship's fragile existence. Above her, the 1st Combat Air Patrol orbited in lazy circles. At 08:15, Radar Watch detected a disturbance, faint contacts on the SK scope, distance 75 miles, approaching fast. Lieutenant Commander Julian D. Beckton, Laffey's commanding officer, didn't hesitate. Sound general quarters. The klaxon blared, men scrambled to battle stations, and within seconds the ship's 5-inch guns were trained skyward. CIC plotted the contacts, 30, then 40, then 50 planes. Multiple raids converging, the radar officer reported. It was another Kikusui, the 4th major attack in 10 days. From their scope deep within the ship, operators relayed vectors to the fighter direction officer aboard USS Bowers, the nearest control destroyer. Intercept Vector 210, came the reply. Cap engaging. But the enemy was too close. Too many. At 08:27, the first Japanese aircraft burst through the clouds, a lone Zero diving straight down. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in white arcs. The pilot slammed his plane into Laffey's after-gun mount, the explosion shaking the hull but failing to cripple her. Seconds later, another kamikaze followed, clipping the mast and spraying the bridge with fragments. Radar operators clung to their consoles, the green glow flickering through smoke. "Radar still operational," someone shouted. They kept tracking. Every minute mattered. the CIC relayed bearings to gunners and interceptors, maintaining the invisible thread of coordination even as the deck burned. Above, Corsairs from VMF 323 streaked through the chaos, guided by those same radar echoes. For the next 80 minutes, Laffey fought a battle beyond comprehension. 22 aircraft attacked in waves, 16 were shot down by gunfire, others exploded against her hull. The sky became a storm of flame and shrapnel. Crewmen were blown overboard, dragged back up, and returned to their stations without orders. The deck ran slick with oil and seawater. Smoke obscured the horizon. Yet within that inferno, discipline held, because radar held. From his station in CIC, Ensign Roy Mahoney called ranges and bearings to the last. Even when the main air search set was knocked out, backup surface radar filled the gap. Every blip they tracked meant seconds of warning for the gunners above. The ship's electronics, battered but alive, turned chaos into survival. By 0945, Laffey was aflame in 7 places, her aft guns wrecked, steering jammed. Yet she refused to die. Damage control crews fought fire with saltwater hoses, ammunition passers carried shells through smoke, and medics worked in corridors lit only by the flicker of burning paint. The final attacker came at 0957, a dive bomber trailing smoke. The remaining 40mm guns roared, and the plane disintegrated in midair, crashing harmlessly into the sea. The battle was over. Laffey had been struck by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. 32 of her crew were dead, more than 70 wounded. But she stayed afloat. When reporters later asked Captain Beckton how, he said quietly, "Because my men refused to let her sink, and because radar told us what was coming." Admiral Spruance later called Laffey the ship that wouldn't die. But to her crew, the miracle was not just courage, it was foresight. Every second of warning from those glowing screens had bought them life. Radar, in that hour, proved it could do more than win battles. It could preserve hope amid catastrophe. The picket line paid dearly. 20 destroyers lost or crippled before the campaign's end. But their sacrifice shielded the invasion fleet and the thousands of Marines ashore. For every Laffey that burned, hundreds of landing craft and carriers survived untouched. Technology had not removed war's cost. It had redirected it, concentrating the danger on those whose courage formed the first barrier. When Laffey limped back to Okinawa, her hull blackened, sailors on other ships stood in silence as she passed. The radar masts above her still turned, slow, steady, unbroken. The same pulse that had guided her through hell would soon guide others through what came next. The radar picket system had held. The enemy's last hope of breaking the invasion had shattered against a wall of precision and endurance. Yet the victory came at a human price, still mounting beneath the waves. By late April 1945, the radar picket line north and west of Okinawa had become the most dangerous duty in the Pacific. Of the 101 destroyers assigned to the radar screen during the campaign, 30 were hit and 10 were lost outright. Yet without them, the U.S. Fifth Fleet could not have survived the relentless air onslaught. Their sacrifice bought the minutes, sometimes mere seconds, that turned disaster into defense. After Laffey's ordeal, Admiral Spruance ordered immediate revisions to picket defense. Additional support vessels, LCSL and LSMR gunboats, were dispatched to each station, bristling with rockets and 40mm guns. Destroyer escorts were rotated more frequently to prevent exhaustion. Coordination between shipborne radars and the newly established GCI, ground-controlled intercept stations on Okinawa, was tightened. By early May, the island's airfields at Yontan and Kadena housed full radar arrays of their own, creating seamless coverage that stretched nearly 200 miles. The system now operated as a living organism. Long-range SK sets at sea detected raids early. Height-finding radars determined altitude. Ashore, GCI stations guided replacement cap directly from runways. The moment a blip appeared on a destroyer's screen, 3 networks reacted simultaneously. Carriers readied aircraft, island interceptors launched, and artillery on Okinawa primed for engagement. This synergy made the once vulnerable fleet almost impenetrable. The Japanese air effort, meanwhile, was collapsing. After Kikusui 4 and V in late April, the losses were unsustainable. By May, many raids comprised obsolete trainers and biplanes fitted crudely with bombs. Pilots received only a few hours of instruction. Many could barely navigate. Ugaki's command on Kyushu grew desperate. Radio intercepts recorded him urging subordinates to strike until the gods themselves intervene. Yet no divine intervention came. Each raid ended the same way: detected, tracked, intercepted, and annihilated. American commanders began noticing a shift in tempo. Where once radar screens had been crowded with returns, now entire hours passed with no contacts. Crews who had lived on caffeine and adrenaline for weeks suddenly found themselves in uneasy quiet. Some called it the silence of victory. Others feared it meant a final storm. That storm came in fragments. The Japanese launched Kikusui 9 and X in early June, but even these massive attempts, hundreds of planes, barely reached the outer radar stations. Coordinated caps and the overlapping coverage of sea and land radar broke them apart before they approached the fleet. Operationally, the Americans had achieved something unprecedented: real-time control of an air battle over a 100-mile front. Radar data passed from destroyers to carriers in seconds. FDOs aboard flagship Bunker Hill could direct intercepts based on readings from ships they could not even see. The analog plotting boards and voice circuits created the world's first integrated air defense network. It was crude by post-war standards, yet astonishingly effective. The results spoke in numbers. Between April and June 1945, the Japanese launched roughly 1,800 aircraft in kamikaze operations against Okinawa. Of these, more than 1,400 were destroyed before reaching their targets. The remainder inflicted severe but localized damage. 30 ships sunk, mostly pickets. Compared to the scale of attack, the survival of the main fleet was miraculous. For the Americans, the cost was borne in exhaustion and attrition, not defeat. Radar operators developed 1,000-yard stares. Gunners fought muscle tremors from endless alert status. But the system had worked. Information had replaced surprise, and with it, the initiative of war. When the Navy's after-action report for Okinawa was compiled, one conclusion stood out. Radar fighter direction was decisive. Without it, the fleet could not have endured the assault. The report listed specific recommendations: more radar-equipped pickets, specialized escort screens, and improved communication circuits, all of which would shape the future of naval warfare. The battle for the sky above Okinawa was over. The next question was what this new mastery of detection meant for the world about to emerge from the ashes. The lessons of Okinawa extended far beyond the smoke-streaked waters of the Pacific. What unfolded there between April and June 1945 was more than a naval engagement. It was the birth of the modern air defense network. The U.S. Navy had entered the campaign relying on radar as a tool. It emerged with radar as a doctrine. Within weeks of victory, engineers and tacticians aboard the Fifth Fleet began formalizing what they called the radar screen concept, a layered, multi-node defense system integrating detection, communication, and firepower. The experience of ships like Laffey, Bush, and Callahan proved that information, not armor, was the true shield of the fleet. The new generation of carrier task forces would never again sail without a ring of radar-guided sentinels. Ashore, at Okinawa itself, the GCI installations established at Yontan and Kadena became prototypes for what the Air Force would later call control and reporting centers. The United States recognized that the same technology that guided fighters over the Ryukyus could protect entire nations. When the Cold War dawned only a few years later, the radar nets that watched for kamikazes would evolve into the DU line and NORAD's watchtowers scanning for Soviet bombers. For Japan, the revelation came too late. Post-war analysis of captured documents showed how little the Imperial Navy had understood of radar warfare. Their own radar sets, the Type 13 and Type 22, were unreliable, short-ranged, and often inoperative due to lack of spare parts. Pilots were not trained to fly under radar control. Communications discipline was poor. The concept of centralized fighter direction had never been fully grasped. What they faced at Okinawa was, to them, a phantom army, omniscient, coordinated, unstoppable. Historians would later mark Okinawa as the first true network-centric battle. Every blip on a scope represented not a machine, but a relationship, ship to plane, radar to gunfire, decision to consequence. The victory belonged not only to the admirals or pilots, but to the unseen men who plotted arcs with grease pencils in dim rooms, who interpreted faint echoes into deadly certainty. Yet the triumph was shadowed by loss. The radar picket destroyers, those slender gray hulls thrust into isolation, had absorbed the war's last full measure of fury. Their crews understood that technology could save many, but not all. The line between survival and sacrifice often came down to seconds of data, to the endurance of one operator who refused to blink. When USS Laffey was towed back to the United States later that year, she became a symbol of that endurance. Her battle-scarred hull was studied by engineers, her CIC dissected by tacticians. The reports were clear. Radar and coordination had saved her, but only because men had refused to yield when every instrument failed. In the synthesis of courage and science lay the future of warfare. From Okinawa forward, every fleet action would be fought in two dimensions, one visible, of ships and planes, and one invisible, of pulses, frequencies, and vectors. The age of mechanical war had ended. The electronic age had begun. The Japanese pilots who vanished over the sea did not know that their final battle had rewritten the logic of combat. The Americans who tracked them did not yet know they had glimpsed the foundations of global surveillance, missile guidance, and electronic command that would define the next century. But in the static hum of their radar rooms, history's new rhythm had begun. The Battle of Okinawa was not only the last great confrontation of the Pacific War. It was a quiet revolution conducted in waves of invisible energy. Beneath the roar of engines and the flash of tracer fire, something far deeper was changing. War, once fought by sight and sound, had entered an age where victory belonged to those who could see beyond the human eye. Radar gave the Americans that vision. It turned night into day, storm into order, confusion into precision. But it was not the machines alone that won the skies. It was the men who learned to trust them. Young operators hunched over screens, voices steady amid chaos, became the unseen commanders of an electronic battlefield. Every green flicker they followed was a life balanced between existence and erasure. For the Japanese, the defeat in those skies marked the end of an old faith. That courage alone could defy science. They fought bravely, even beautifully, but bravery could not hide them from the pulse that found them miles away. Radar stripped away illusion. It left only truth. When the war ended months later, the Pacific was dotted with the silent hulks of ships that had fought blind and died. Yet out of that wreckage rose a new understanding of power, one built not merely on guns or ships, but on awareness, coordination, and timing. USS Laffey still exists today, preserved as a museum. Her decks are quiet now, her radar silent. Yet if one stands within her darkened CIC, the faint hum of electricity seems to linger. as if the echoes of 1945 still circle in the air. Okinawa's sky taught the modern world a final lesson. That knowledge is defense, and vigilance its cost. In the space between the radar's sweep and the heartbeat of a sailor, the outcome of empires was decided.